In the early hours of January 3rd, the United States carried out a shocking military operation in Venezuela. U.S. forces seized President Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores and flew them to New York, where they're now being held and facing federal drug trafficking charges. Maduro has pled not guilty. What has stunned many observers is not only the arrest itself, but the way that it happened. The operation was unilateral. It was carried out on the territory of another sovereign state without authorization from the UN and without consent from authorities in Venezuela. A growing number of human rights and international law experts have described this action by the US as a violation of the UN Charter and a dangerous signal that powerful states may increasingly act outside the legal rules meant to restrain the use of force.
Inside Venezuela and among Venezuelans abroad, the reactions have been mixed and complicated. Of course, in the immediate sense, there's a sense of great relief because the Maduro government has presided over deep repression, economic collapse, stolen elections, mass migration, widespread human rights violations. Everyone's happy to see him gone. But alongside this relief, there's also a sense of unease. First of all, it's not clear if the entire regime has been dismantled with power being transferred to the vice president. And more broadly, when a powerful country acts outside of international law, it can weaken institutions, invite retaliation, and set precedents that other governments might follow and use for their own purposes.
And even with Maduro gone from Caracas, there is nothing about Venezuela's future that is secure. The political volume raises really hard questions. Who is going to govern now? How are these rights enforced when institutions are fragile and contested? And what role, if any, is the US going to play after taking action that many consider unlawful and destabilizing? To think through these layered questions, we're going to turn to someone who has been at the center of Venezuelan politics and its opposition movement for more than a decade, Leopoldo López.
We spoke with Lopez months before this U.S. operation, and listening now, the conversation feels almost prophetic. Leopoldo López is a former mayor of Caracas's Chacao district, a founder of the opposition party Voluntad Popular, and one of the most visible figures challenging Nicolas Maduro's rule. In 2014, he helped organize nationwide demonstrations calling for democratic reform and accountability, and he attempted to run for president. The regime's response was to arrest him, accuse him of inciting violence, and sentencing him to nearly 14 years in prison, a conviction which was widely condemned abroad.
From prison, Lopez became a central figure in the international legal struggle as well. He brought a case before the Inter-American Court, which found serious violations of his political rights and due process. He spent years in solitary confinement and then under house arrest, before eventually escaping and going into exile. His story, though, is not only about repression, it's also about strategy, risk, and the ethics of resistance. He wrestles in his conversation with us with questions that activists face when institutions in their own countries collapse. When do protests become too dangerous? And how do you confront authoritarian power without strengthening it? And what responsibility do leaders bear for the consequences of the movements they help create?
Today, Lopez lives outside Venezuela, and he continues to advocate for democratic change while reflecting honestly about the hard choices, the missteps even, and the personal costs of political struggle for those who engage in it.
In this episode, we're going to hear directly from Lopez, and we're going to talk not just about Venezuela's past, but also about this pivotal moment. We're going to talk about what the illegal U.S. operation could mean for Venezuelan democracy now, and what happens when human rights, as they are here, are violated both by an authoritarian government, but also by a powerful, arguably self-interested democracy. And we're going to hold all of that complexity at once. And as we always try to do, stay committed to the Human Rights Project, even when the path forward is deeply uncertain as it is here.
I am from Venezuela. I was born in a democratic Venezuela, grew up with this idea that democracy was inevitable and it was there to stay, like the oxygen, that don't think about it, it will be there. I had the opportunity of studying in the U.S. I did my college and grad school work at the U.S. Then I went back to Venezuela. I worked as an economist at the oil industry. Then when Chavez came to power, along with a group of young people, decided to run for the Constituent Assembly. And I had to resign my job at the oil industry. We didn't make it. There was no representation of minorities or in the electoral system. So with 54% of the vote, Chavez got 95% of the seats. So I was unemployed and started a movement of young people going into politics, and that took me to become the mayor of Chacao, which is at the heart of Caracas. So I was mayor of Caracas for 8 years. I was elected in 2000, re-elected in the year 2004. Then when I was going for higher office, was to become the governor of Caracas. I had more than 70% of the vote. I was disqualified to run for office, and that's actually my first personal encounter with human rights. I took my case to the Human Rights Court in Costa Rica, and actually after 4 years, I was able to win the case against the state of Venezuela, and it was the first case of the Human Rights Court of the OAS that decided on an issue of political rights. It was the very first case, so we got a victory there. In the meantime, I started another movement. It was focused on grassroots activism and nonviolent action. And in the year 2012, there was a presidential election. I was running as a presidential candidate. I was having great levels of support. And even though I won my case at the Human Rights Court, the decision of Chavez at the time was that I was not going to be able to register. And they took it even a step further. So my case and the decision made by the Human Rights Court led to the decision made by Chavez to leave the Inter-American human rights system. So it was after the decision on my case that Venezuela left the Inter-American human rights system. So fast forward a bit, in the year 2013, there was an election. Maduro was fraudulently elected. So in the year 2014, in January of 2014, we called for protests, and tens of thousands of people took the streets, and there was a warrant for my arrest. I went into hiding, and I had three options. I could stay in hiding, I could go into exile, or I could turn myself in. And I decided to turn myself in, very conscious of what I was doing, and that took me to prison for the next 7 years. So I spent the next 4 years in solitary confinement in a military prison, the military prison of Ramo Verde in Caracas, or close to Caracas. I was sentenced to 14 years of imprisonment. My crime was my speech, calling Maduro a narc and exposing his links with the drug trafficking groups, calling for the people to take the streets. And my speech was at the core of the case. So I was sentenced to 14 years, and since there was no element of proof against me, the judge concluded that I had the capacity of sending subliminal messages to the Venezuelan people that actually led the people to take the streets. So be careful if you're listening to me, because I will be able to send subliminal messages. You might not even know that you're getting these subliminal messages.
Now you've warned us, so I don't know. They'll be less effective, I think.
But the magic can play. The magic can play. So according to the judge, I had the capacity of sending subliminal messages to millions of people. So I, after 4.5 years, I was able to escape prison and went to the Spanish embassy, where I stayed another 1.5 years. The embassy at the time was under siege. Electricity was cut. It was surrounded by the thugs of the regime. And at the very end of 2020, I made a decision I never thought I was going to make, but I had to. That was to leave my country. So I escaped Venezuela. And since then, I've been living in exile. I live in Madrid. I followed my family. This is what happens when you go into exile. You follow your loved ones. And since then, I continue to be directly involved with Venezuela, but I also started a movement called the World Liberty Congress, that is an alliance of freedom fighters and democracy defenders from autocratic countries. It's a movement that has grown a great deal, and it has given all of us the opportunity to understand that beyond our natural differences, language, religion, skin color, traditions, when it comes to fighting against an autocratic regime, it's the same fight. It's exactly the same fight with the same challenges. So it's been an incredible experience to all of us to learn from each other and to understand that this is a global fight. And I truly believe that human rights has no borders, as I'm sure you believe, and that freedom and democracy should be a human right. Because if you believe in freedom, the only way that you can be free, truly free, is under a democracy. And I am now, more than before, a true believer that these are rights that anyone, anywhere in the planet should be given to. The right to elect whoever is governing them, the right to live under the rule of law, and the right to have your basic human rights respected. So in a nutshell, that's what I've been doing the past years.
I have so many questions for you, but maybe we'll start with Venezuela because, of course, the regime continues to ignore elections. I think last year, again, the people voted overwhelmingly for change, and the regime never honors it. You know, as I look at Venezuelan history in the last 3 decades, it started as a situation of sort of slow decline of democracy, a backsliding situation. And then it seems to have just fallen off a cliff at some point. They just didn't even pretend anymore. And I wonder if you think that pattern is something that, you know, many Americans, are concerned about our democracy. We feel like we're in a situation of slow decline. When was the moment you realized you no longer lived in a democracy?
Well, in the case of Venezuela, at least for me, it was very early on in the process, and actually that's why we called Maduro a dictator in 2013. At the time, if you took an opinion poll in Venezuela, the majority of the people didn't think that we were in a dictatorship, and the people analyzing Venezuela from outside did not expressively say that Venezuela was a dictatorship. But all of the elements were there. It was very clear. In the case of Venezuela, actually, the takeover of democracy started from within. So the case of Venezuela is an autocracy that grew from within democracy. Chavez was elected, and after he was elected, the first thing he did was to change the constitution. So he changed the constitution, and the next step was changing the people that were running the institutions of the Venezuelan state. And one thing led to another. And I have seen this pattern in other countries where democracy is killed from within. And there are very clear patterns, in my view. One of them is the suffocation of freedom of expression. At the time, I remember that I myself was a bit doubtful of all of the people calling for more freedom of expression. It was clear that this was a problem, but I didn't really truly understand how much it could impact society at large. At times, I thought this was an issue that was concerning mostly the owners of the big media and journalists. But that's where it started. They started to close radio stations, newspapers, limiting the paper that was the newspapers were having access, then trying to censor the opinion programs. And that grew gradually until Chavez decided to close an entire TV station, and it became very clear, and this was a moment where there were a lot of protests because of it. So freedom of expression and the attack on the media is a very clear sign of democracy under attack from within. Another very clear signal that we saw in Venezuela was the takeover of the judicial system, of judges, of the Attorney General's office. And this was very clear from the beginning that there was no independence of the judicial system in Venezuela. Today, you cannot find a single judge, not even one. There's not a single judge in Venezuela that can decide independently. If there is a case that nobody cares about, politically speaking, maybe a judge can decide upon his judgment. But most cases, especially politically sensitive cases, the judges are simply the messengers of the will of the regime. And this happened gradually until it became the pattern. Then the third signal in the case of Venezuela was the politicization of the armed forces and the police. This was very clear from the beginning. Chavez, being a military himself, started to politicize the armed forces, started to recognize people within the structure, not because of their merits, but because of their political loyalty. The actual structure of the armed forces changed in a way that the armed forces were more focused in keeping the internal control than any external threat on the country, which is the core of the mission of the armed forces. So these were three clear signals that we saw in Venezuela, and I've seen them in other countries. Our case, in the case of Venezuela, although we are now under a full-fledged autocratic regime with, I'm just coming back from Thailand, Cambodia, and Indonesia with friends from the World Liberty Congress. These are autocratic countries, but when I compare these countries to Venezuela, and even when I compare some African countries to Venezuela, Venezuela is way worse, way more autocratic than many of these countries that are also autocratic. So the case of Venezuela is one that it was a gradual loss of democracy until it was a complete loss of democracy. And that's a story. But in parallel to that decaying of the democratic institutions, the civil society in Venezuela has resisted over and over. Even last year, there was an election. Everybody knew that there could be a fraudulent takeover of the election by the regime, but people went out and voted, and we won the election. People have been taking the streets over and over by the millions. There is a permanent resistance in the hearts of the Venezuelan people. So I am sure, and I am hopeful, that very soon we will be able to make the formal transition to democracy.
One of the concerns here, I think, from civil society and from those of us that do this kind of work here is the issue of pre-compliance. On one hand, you don't want to take unnecessary risks, but on the other hand, you start sort of doing what it is that the government wants you to do because you're trying not to take unnecessary risks. And obviously, you made a bunch of strategic decisions yourself about what risks you were willing to take. So can you talk a little bit about what you saw people starting to do in terms of regulating themselves or in terms of restricting themselves, and how you thought about that? You mentioned that you thought that the concerns about freedom of expression at the beginning were maybe not real concerns, and at some point decided that they were. So what was the process there that was like coming from the inside, from the people themselves, and not necessarily directly being imposed by the state?
Well, I do think that that censorship plays a very big part in the way in which autocratic regimes take control of just complete societies. It's always a really interesting question to make and to try to answer: how a group of thousands can take control of millions, and that's effectively what happens. The case of Venezuela is very clear, but certainly not the only one, where you have millions of people that oppose a regime, but nevertheless the regime still has control. And I believe that this has to do with the effective management of threats and fear. And the way it was very clear in Venezuela, but I've seen it in many other cases, is selective repression. A selective repression that creates the condition where everyone is 1 degree away from someone that can clearly be identified with them, that has been repressed, taken to prison, killed, processed, or just been the focus of repression. So let me explain this. So the way this massive repression and traduced into massive fear which in itself traduced into social control, was by selecting different people. So they went for the union leaders. So that was a message to the union leaders, then to the business people, then to the journalists, then to the students, then to the landowners, then to the indigenous communities, then to just people posting in social media, then to politicians. So it became very clear for anyone from any sector and any region of the country that they could be a target of repression. And this has been the approach. And I think it's been existing for centuries. But once you see it, and you see it in your own country, you can start to understand fear. You can start to understand the way people self-censor themselves, the way they stop posting. So now people in Venezuela don't post in social media. And this has been happening for a while. People have been deciding not even to talk in family gatherings. I remember I grew up in a family that had political prisoners from previous dictators. So my great-grandfather was a political prisoner himself. He died in exile. My grandfather was also detained by a previous dictatorship. So I grew up in a family where these stories were always present. And I remember my grandmother saying, at the time, we were very concerned that the walls were listening. And I couldn't really understand what she was saying. You know, I was like, what do you mean the walls are listening? I mean, what do you mean a society that is surveilling its own people? I mean, it was completely out of my cognitive understanding that your own family could be affecting your well-being, your security, your safety. But now that's what happens. People don't speak. I have seen how this has changed in a great deal behaviors of people, and it's understandable. It's understandable because people have to live their day to day. People have to eat, have to feed their kids, have to survive. And if surviving means that there is just this one thing you cannot talk about, which is politics, so you do that. But I'm very proud of the Venezuelan people because even though we are undergoing great levels of stress and permanent attacks by the regime, people continue to fight in their own way. It's different. It's more difficult now, but that continues to happen on a daily basis.
Leopoldo, I think a lot of us have been part of conversations where some people are observing that there's a rise of autocratic governments and that states are becoming sort of more insular, and there are, conservative movements that are repressing speech that are kind of becoming more and more prominent in the world. Do you see it that way?
If we take the state of the world, as stated by Freedom House, BDEM, Economist Intelligence Unit, 15 years ago, between 40 and 45% of the population was living under some sort of autocratic regime. Today, it's 72%. So it's very clear that there is a growth of autocracy globally. But primarily it's China, Iran, and Russia that are leading this axis of autocracies that is creating a space to collaborate. I have seen this in the case of Venezuela. That's the very intimate collaboration alongside different issues: energy, military, kleptocratic networks, the use of communications, the use of technology, the manipulation of social media, the closing of the civic space, which is a very clear one, where you see these laws against civil society being passed in countries as different as Russia, Thailand, or Venezuela that are basically copy-paste. So yes, the answer is yes, there is for sure, objectively speaking, a growth of autocracy worldwide. However, I think it's a mistake, and I see that very often, to think that this is an ideological trend. And it's not. It's not. I mean, if you look at the mighty autocratic powers in the world, China, communist, Russia, nationalist, Iran, theocratic, there is absolutely non-ideological lines that bind them together. What binds them together, I think, is a commitment to hold on to power and a common enemy. And that common enemy is democracy itself. We need to defend democracy in its capacity to bring together people from different ideologies. I mean, that's the core of what democracy is, that you can bring different ideologies under the same roof, under the similar and same rules of the game, and that people decide.
You acknowledge that there is a rise of autocracies, and it's not ideological. So what is it that's happening that's making it so that parties that come into power are trying to hold on to power in that way? Like, what is it that we're seeing is the first part. And then the second part is, some of these leaders are being elected in majoritarian democratic ways. So if we're trying to defend democracy, what is it about democracy that is then maybe like eating itself from the inside a little bit? I want to know what your sense is.
Well, I think your first question and your second question they are related. I think that democracy itself has a huge problem, which is delivering to the large majority of the people. I mean, there is, large levels of frustration by not delivering. And I think that, that golden decade of the 1990s, where we thought that history had ended and that it was inevitable that democracy was just going to happen in every corner of the world, and it was just a matter of time, and it was just about creating the conditions for civil society to be ready for the democratic transition. I mean, this was even the thinking to open China to the global markets under the idea that once China had a big middle class, that they were going to adhere to liberal values of freedom and that democracy was going to be inevitable. 36 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we can see that this played out in a very, very different way. And I think that the reasons why from democracy you're seeing this rise of autocratic solutions, one is because democracy is not delivering, for sure. I think it's not delivering to the interest of the large majority of the people. And two, I think that social media has played a big role. I think that the manipulation of just the state of the public opinion and just this has had a tremendous impact. I've seen it in different countries. So democracy in itself is undergoing its own crisis of delivering to the people. We are certainly not in the 1990s where, people were, I was in grad school at the time, and I remember, democracy was just, it was the promised land, and everybody in one way or another was very engaged in working to this idea to bring democracy, to have, the global village was going to be a global democratic village, and there was a lot of commitment to making democracy spread out throughout the world. And that changed, certainly changed at the turn of the century. And I think you can identify some milestones. Maybe, what happened in 2001, it kind of shifted the world's attention after the attack in New York and the terrorist attack and the war in Iraq. I think that shifted the attention, from democracy expansion to this approach to terrorism. And then I also think that 2008 and the financial crisis of 2008 also created this disenchantment of the population in terms of democracy delivering in the very basic things of having a savings account, being able to have a house, being able to have a job after you graduate. So I think those were two things that happened in the past 25 years that certainly made a great impact in the way democracy was being perceived within democracies.
Yeah, and of course, there's also a political economy to this as well. In our country, we talk a lot about oligarchy and what we've seen happen in Russia and such. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Venezuela, because, I don't think Americans follow the extent to which the regime is bound up with the narco traffickers, and how does that help sustain the regime?
Well, in the case of Venezuela, I think if for most people who might be listening today, if we talk about Venezuela, many people might think that Venezuela is an oil economy. It's an oil-rich country. And that's no longer true. Venezuela has immense amounts of reserves, but we are no longer a mighty oil producer. When Chavez came to power, we were producing 3.6 million barrels of oil. Today, we're producing less than 800,000 barrels of oil. And the economy in Venezuela collapsed. It had a contraction of the GDP up to 70%, something that has basically not been seen in any other case. And the economy shifted. And now I think that the best way to understand the political economy of Venezuela is it's a criminal political economy. So the pillars of that economy are oil, but oil being sold to the black market. Oil today is being sold to the Chinese market through all sorts of intermediaries with very heavy discounts that allow to very heavy corruption commissions. The second pillar is the massive extraction and commerce of gold that has as a primary consequence the destruction of the Venezuelan rainforest and of the most beautiful landscapes of Venezuela are being destroyed. The third pillar is contraband, and this is something that we in Venezuela know very well, the contraband with our neighbors. And the fourth is cocaine trafficking. So up to 20% of the cocaine that leaves Colombia goes through Venezuela. And there is, I think, adequately so an understanding now that the problem of Venezuela is a problem of an organized crime structure that has taken over the state. So the U.S. designated the Cartel de los Soles as a terrorist organization, and I agree with that. And I think that there might be a misunderstanding of what this cartel means, because some people, even some very knowledgeable journalists, say there is no such thing as Cartel de los Soles. Well, if you think of cartels in the traditional way as the Chapo Guzman or the Pablo Escobar cartels in Mexico and Colombia, the case of Venezuela is different because it's the state made into a cartel, the state made into a criminal organized crime structure. I think that the best comparison to Venezuela is Russia, that has a state structure that is committed and delivers on the organized crime approaches that Russia has for many activities. And in the case of Venezuela, it's very clear that the structure of the state, the judges, the military, the police, the governors, the mayors, all the way up to Maduro, they are involved in this structure of organized crime.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the situation in the United States with Venezuelan refugees. The Biden administration had granted Venezuelan refugees temporary protected status, and that has just been removed by the Trump administration. I mean, what should we be doing, both on the refugees and more broadly, from the United States for Venezuela?
Yes. Well, the first thing that I would ask is for anyone who is listening is to understand that the Venezuelan people are not criminals. So I think that's the main impact that has happened in the U.S. over the past years is this perception of Venezuelans. And anyone who knows Venezuelans in the U.S. and beyond, they know that Venezuelans are, working people that are trying to make their way through. Nobody wanted to leave their country. I didn't want to leave my country. No Venezuelan, or I don't think, I've never met anyone who, wanted to leave their country because they wanted to leave. People are forced to leave their countries for many different reasons. A third of our country, 1/3, 10 million people of a population of 30 million people has been forced to leave our country. And I do believe that the Maduro regime did have a strategy to send criminals and to send people that were linked to criminal organizations, not just to the U.S., but to other countries. There is a very famous case of a member of the military that was in exile in Chile, and he was abducted, tortured, and killed by a criminal organization that is led by the second on board of the Maduro regime, Diosdado Cabello. So, yes, there has been an approach of the regime to send criminals abroad, to control them, but this has had a tremendous impact on millions of people. What do I hope? I hope that the people who are in Venezuela can be allowed to remain in the U.S. I hope that this issue of the TPS gets solved. I know it's part of an ongoing legal process that has up until now allowed some Venezuelans to stay. But I can also tell you that the fear that the people live on a daily basis, many people, and this is not just Venezuelans, but others, are not sending their kids to school. They're not going to church. They're not moving around just because of fear that they can be detained and sent back to Venezuela. But I think that the best migration policy towards Venezuela is to promote democratic change in our country. I have no doubt about that, no doubt. I mean, if there is democratic change in Venezuela, and we have seen this in many opinion polls that we've done of Venezuelans living abroad and Venezuelans living in Venezuela, if there is a transition to democracy, I have no doubt that many people will go back and that people will stop leaving, because the main reason why people decide to leave is because of Maduro himself. So the best migration policy towards Venezuela, if migration is a priority, is to promote, support democratic change in our country.
Leopoldo, can you tell us about the World Liberty Congress? It's a coalition of activists that are fighting autocrats. Can you tell us like what the goal is and how you're organized?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, at the end of 2020, I came into exile, and I had been to prison, house arrest, persecuted, but the beginning of my exile was maybe the toughest thing that I had to go through in the past 15, 20 years. I've had, murder attempts, all sorts of things that I've had to deal with. But being in exile was very tough because I was no longer in my country. So I started to meet other people like myself from other countries, from Iran, Afghanistan, Belarus, Russia, Nicaragua, and understood that what I was going through personally was very similar to what other people in exile were going through. And it became very clear that we were not only stateless, but we were also, in a way, kind of searching for a way to impact our core. Because if you're a political prisoner, or if you are involved in this, your core being is it's your fight. I mean, I love my country. I live for my country. I have a tattoo of my country in my leg. This is what I live and breathe. And this is the reality of many people. So it became very clear that, one, we were facing the same challenges. Two, that autocrats were coalescing, that they were collaborating amongst themselves. We spoke about this earlier. And three, that there was no alliance to support people at the front lines from autocratic regimes. There are plenty of global alliances. Most of them are around political lines. So you have the Socialist International, you have the political parties from the right, you have the conservatives, but that's alongside ideological lines. And this is, I think, in many cases, this ideological alignment of the problem, I'm talking about autocratic countries, many times creates a distortion. So we decided to create an alliance of democracy defenders, freedom fighters, committed to the core values of democracy, being free and fair elections, the respect for the rule of law, and the respect for human rights. And around those three basic ideas, you can have a huge diversity. So in the World Liberty Congress, we have a diversity of ideology, but we have clear commitment to democracy. So we started in 2022. We did our first event in Vilnius, Lithuania. We did it there because we wanted to make a statement after the Russian invasion to Ukraine. We gathered representatives from 40 countries, and it was such an incredible moment to all of us, because it was, kind of like meeting your own. It was like the realization of all of us that we were part of a global movement without even knowing it. So it was, it was magical. And then we decided to make a movement of this. So in the year 2023, we met again in Vilnius, and we decided to practice democracy, to defend democracy. So we held an election to elect our leadership council and to elect our executive council and to decide what were going to be the strategic priorities and programs for the World Liberty Congress. So we have been working alongside the issues of political prisoners, supporting the families and relatives of political prisoners. We have been working to support the youth movements. We have been working in bringing technology to improve the capacities of movements on the ground. We have been working on how to make exiled movements more effective. So we've created our own agenda. And this year, we will be having our General Assembly in Berlin. Last year, I was invited to give a keynote speech alongside with Masih Ali-Najat, my co-founder, in Berlin. And basically what we talked, it was on the context of the anniversary of the fall of the wall. And basically what we both said was that they were celebrating the fall of the wall as something from the past, but there is no more powerful symbol than the fall of the wall to those of us who are fighting against autocracy. Everybody in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, when they think of the moment of making all of our dreams come true, is the fall of the wall, the fall of the regime. But we are dreamers. We are idealistic, and we dream of our countries being free. And when you see that there are people, from all countries, from all parts of the world, thinking, feeling, and fighting in the same way, it encourages, because the gasoline of freedom fighters is hope.
So Tom, it feels very strange that we had this conversation with Leopoldo before all of this happened in Venezuela. And as you know, it was actually the next episode we were going to release. And it was a really moving conversation because he's very impressive. I was actually wondering what he was thinking, and we haven't had a chance to talk to him. But what I want to hear some of your reactions, and I want to tell you a bit about, my Latin American family and some of the things that I've been hearing from their perspective, because it's quite complicated.
Yeah, I'm really interested to hear about that. I mean, obviously, from my perspective, it's a somewhat disastrous return to sort of 19th century imperialist politics. There are many reasons to hate the Venezuelan regime. There would be many reasons to celebrate its collapse. What's interesting about this moment is that those don't seem to be the reasons that Donald Trump has intervened. Instead, it seems to be motivated by a combination of trying to extract oil from Venezuela. There's not any particular reason that we need all that oil or that we should be, invading countries to extract their resources. That's very much a 19th century idea. But then the other much more concerning thing from a human rights perspective is there's a very real possibility that the regime's just going to recalibrate and stay intact. This was not a regime like, let's say, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, where it was very much a personal dictatorship. Maduro just happened to be the head of a cabal of people and institutions, including the military, including the bureaucracy, the vicious Minister of Interior, who are all still there. And if they're still there, why would anyone think that the government has actually changed? So I find it very distressing, honestly, not just the precedent, but even the situation for the Venezuelans on the ground. It's not clear that things are even going to be moderately better.
The thing that I've been hearing from, Venezuelan exiled citizens is that there is deep corruption in the government. And as you just said, that Maduro was sort of the head and obviously an important component of it, but that there's a lot underneath there that is not going to change. And it's just going to be a reshifting of actors. It's interesting because what I've been hearing from my family in Peru is, they're confused because I think Venezuela also, because of all the migrants in Venezuela that have ended up in other countries, there are just complicated relationships now because of, the refugees essentially who have been going to other countries and then those other countries have their own feelings about the presence of refugees. And so I think a lot of the Latin American neighbors wanted a stable Venezuela. And Maduro was, I think, sort of uniformly seen as a pariah and as a leader that needed to be unseated. And my arguments that we need to think about the implications of this aren't necessarily resonating. I think that even though people are concerned with the fact that this may be setting a new precedent for the U.S. to invade countries where it has an interest or doesn't like the leaders, it was kind of a smart first country to do this with, if that's the plan.
Well, I hope it's not the plan. Your comment reminds me of when we were in Chile. Now, 3 or 4 years ago, about 5 years ago, there was the social explosion in Chile. And you may remember that some of the comments on the streets of Chile was that this was all caused by Venezuelan gangs and things like this.
Yeah.
And there's always that, sort of temptation to externalize one's problems onto migrants. And there are many, many, refugees and migrants from Venezuela, of course, because of the horrible performance of the regime. But from the point of view of human rights, of democracy, of all that is good and true, the things, have not improved at all and may be worse.
Yeah. What do you think this does to the sort of ongoing story of the UN's inability to actually keep states from flagrantly breaking international law?
Well, the UN, it's hard to say what role it's played, in that regard. It's self-interest and structure, and bipolarity, which kept the world, kept interstate war down during the Cold War period. But really, the blame here, I think, is not really, to be put onto the UN, which has always been only as effective as its member states want it to be, but on the great powers. Is it really a better world to return to 19th century ideas of imperialism? Is that a more legitimate international order? Clearly not. Is that a more stable international order? Clearly not. I just, don't understand, frankly, the crude nature of the rhetoric coming out of Washington, the sort of willingness to throw out American ideals completely, even rhetorically. And from an international law perspective, what's interesting is they haven't even made an argument.
Yeah.
Typically, when countries do things like this, they make an argument. So when the U.S., for example, deposed General Noriega from Panama in 1989, in that case, we went in and we removed him, just as in this case. But we made an argument as to why that was legal. For example, General Noriega was not a head of state. He was not legally or constitutionally in Panama the sitting head of state. Maduro is, and heads of state have, under customary international law and thus under American common law, head of state immunity. They can't be charged with things while they're sitting in office. So you would need to go through some formal procedure to have the person, resign from office in order to charge them with a crime. They haven't even done that. They haven't made they haven't claimed that this was an armed attack that was justified in any way under the UN Charter. So that's really seems much more serious in some sense. They're just not even pretending to give lip service to the regime, which has always been observed, in the breach, I suppose you could say, but at least there's the civilizing force of hypocrisy, as they say. When you're forced to give justifications under international law, it sort of reinforces some of the norms.
Like, there are processes for determining that a state leader is not functioning as state leader in a way that's actually harmful enough that the international community needs to react. And the process is not for one country to just decide it's going to go in and remove that leader.
Yeah, but what did you think of the, gestures towards the doctrine of humanitarian intervention earlier in this century? The idea seems to be dead now, but certainly there was a lot of discussion in the United Nations and other places that under some conditions we should be able to engage in a humanitarian intervention.
I think we disagree about this, but also whether or not something is moral to me is like a separate question, because it's a practical, it's a question of practically how the world should be run. And the idea of individual countries deciding whether they're going to invade other countries is off the table for me.
Yeah.
Practically,
Yeah.
even if, lovely things could happen as a result.
Look, you happen to have the force of the UN Charter on your side, so that's why this all seems so 19th century. Yeah. No, I mean, it's all completely illegal. It violates the rules about territorial integrity, about non-interference, about use of force, and of course about head of state immunity. And, you know, those rules, I think this is something we would agree on. Those rules have structure and systemic effects which are good. And, you know, we should aspire to observe them, even if it does mean that sometimes bad regimes continue for a while. So we're headed to a lawless world.
I mean, going back to our conversation with Leopoldo, you know, I think the one interesting thing is what Venezuelans who have been exiled and who played leadership roles in their societies, you know, what it is that they're thinking now. Because, you know, it is, as I said at the beginning, you know, if this was meant to be a test case for the Trump administration, in a way it was a good test case because Maduro was so, you know, he had such a international reputation as being an authoritarian leader. But if you get somebody in place in Venezuela who actually is legitimately a leader in the country, I think it's going to be a lot harder to justify having the U.S. in some kind of role where it's governing or extracting resources or whatever. And I don't know what paths will be open for Venezuelans to try to create some stability there. Yeah.
Well, all we can do is hope for an improvement on the ground for the people who've been suffering under this horrible regime, and hope that this really isn't a precedent. It's just a kind of a test case to see how the world reacts. Certainly what we've seen in the last couple of days is the Europeans reacting very strongly to a suggestion that they could just do this to Greenland, that would be a huge, you know, basically the end of NATO, and that might be something that might restrain some in the administration. Crazy times, Claudia.